Now?
Yeah, now. Go ahead.
Here we have 1941 Studebaker Champion. Believe it or not, we're 4 years into this project already. And what this is a 1941 Studebaker Champion that has had a 4-inch chop top, windshield tilted back, all the window casings were cut down. The rear window, we cut out a rectangle above the rear window, moved it up and welded back in behind and sank the window into the trunk. So this is our new line in the back. So we ended up with just about 4 inches overall in height reduction. The car is sitting on what started out as a 1976 Corvette chassis that was in a rollover that I bought and built a frame jig in the garage. And then I used the basic, in order to make the frame work, I was going to have to put about 11.5 inches into the wheels to get them into the wheel wells on the Studebaker. And while I was on the jig, the more that I pushed the front end up to the end of the jig, the more cool the car looked long. So instead of 11 inches, I put 3 feet into the chassis. So we have a 137.5-inch wheelbase, 1941 Studebaker Champion, based on a Corvette chassis. On the rear end of the chassis, we got rid of the transverse leaf, switched it to coilovers. I got some aftermarket trailing arms, some giant aftermarket trailing arms. We went with 1 inch bigger half shafts. I went with a differential with 273 gears that was built for nostalgic Corvette drag racing, so it's really heavy differential with a Kevlar clutch pack Auburn center section. We did wheel wood brake conversion, so we've got 14-inch rotors front and rear back on a Corvette hat to go on the suspension. And I used 4 pistons all the way around. We've got 11.5 by 18 torque thrusts on the back, 8 by 18s on the front. The rear wheels are set out 3 inches of offset. The front wheels are in about 1 inch. So if you look down the car, the track is pretty close. And we actually have 18-inch wheels all the way around with the same size of brakes on a Corvette chassis. So basically it ought to handle like a big slot car when it's driving down the road. To suspend it, I did find a company that does coil spring conversions for people that do bulletproof cars. So what we have on the front is we have coil springs fitting in the same Corvette original pockets plus 1,250 pounds. So we're able to get this thing fully functioning suspension. Pretty nice stance. To go with the stretched car, I looked for the biggest engine that I could find, and I searched for about a year and came up with this GMC motor. This engine is out of a 1959 Minuteman missile transporter platform that was built by GMC for the government to haul a 225,000-pound Minuteman missile. So this is a V12, 702 cubic inch, that was rebuilt by this company in Evansville, Indiana. And if you look on their website, this car is on their first page of the website. Now the original engines were set up like all government motors for tri-fuel, so they're 7-to-1 compression. They didn't make very much horsepower, but they made a lot of torque. When they were in the missile carrier, they ran 3 transmissions and a 2-speed rear end. So they just ran the engine at a constant speed of 2,800 RPM and used the gears to speed up and slow down. This engine has modern Aries pistons in it, or excuse me, Keith Black pistons in it. It is a 8.9-to-1 compression. It's just under 9.1 compression, but it uses a late model Corvette coil pack setup with a reluctor, so it's a crank trigger ignition with coil packs. This engine makes idles at 400 RPM. We're going to fire it up here in a second. And at 1,050 RPM, and I have the dyno sheet for this engine, at 1,050 it makes 450 horsepower and 685 foot-pounds of torque. That's at 50 RPM over 1,000, which is where a lot of motors idle. The red line on the motor is 4,000 RPM. At 4,000 RPM, it makes 775 horsepower and almost 1,900 foot-pounds of torque, and that's on 87 octane regular gas. So that's no added abnormal aspiration. That's just pump gas breathing through 2 Holley carburetors. To complement the engine, we looked for a transmission that had the ability to handle that kind of torque in case we ever put a trailer on the back of this thing and pulled load with it. So I have a Jake's transmission 4L80 that they built specifically for this engine. And they're out of Texas, and they build monster truck transmissions, so that's basically what this is. It is a 4L80 casing with all billet internals, and that is a 2,000 horsepower continuous use transmission with a torque converter that we got from Circle C Industries in Houston. They make torque converters for the same big monster trucks and mud trucks. So this is a giant Dodge torque converter that's tighter instead of looser. So this torque converter is all in at about 650 RPM instead of about 1,100 RPM, and that way it won't slip into gear running down the highway. The torque converter is good for 2,000 horsepower continuous with 1,000 horsepower nitrous shot on it, so it's a 3,000 horse. Then to go along with the 4L80, gear vendors made for us a tail shaft 2-speed, which is one of their 2-speed units. It's a planetary drive. So we removed the tail shaft on a 4L80, installed a gear vendors. Gear vendors is good for 2,500 horsepower also. We went with a 1350 yoke, which is a 2-ton truck yoke. The drive shaft on the back of this thing came off of a John Deere beam picker. It was the heaviest wall shaft that we could find currently being used as a drive shaft, which is what the drive shaft company has to start with a drive shaft. So we actually have a beam picker drive shaft with 2-ton U-joints on either end of it. And then of course on the differential, we also ran a 1350 U-joint setup on the back of that. Like I said, we've got coilovers on the back. I temporarily installed a 18-gallon fuel cell, so that will let us be able to calculate our miles per gallon or gallons per mile, whatever it turns out to be, and give us a place to start. I installed Lincoln LS seats in the front, and they're actually quite comfortable.
Go ahead, hop in it.
There we go. So this way, if you have to go lowrider, you can actually get down there. Now, best thing is, this motor sounds pretty much like a Corsair or P51 idling getting ready to take off. So we'll fire it up so you can listen to it here. Looks like it's running a lot faster than it is, but if you take a look at the external oil pump belt, you can see how slow the motor's really running. Oh, so much for all that noise. So right now we're at the point where I'm making I made this stub header just as a way to get the exhaust pointed away from the firewall, which is what it's doing right now. We've got some stub exhaust that we're gonna point straight down. It was hard finding a radiator that would cool that size of an engine, so I actually found a 5-core radiator. This radiator is off of a, it was off of a big skid steer track hoe, and I don't remember which brand it was I found, but it was a big diesel track hoe. So this radiator is a 5-core, so even though it's only 22 inches by 26, if it were a 2-core, then the radiator would be about that big. So I think we have the cooling problem solved. A little more sheet metal work, and that's about where we are.